Hello there, my name is Isabel Juarez, and today I am going to be discussing Chapter 8 with the topic being mental disorders. I'm just going to jump right into it, and just like the chapter, it starts off by discussing by discussing and relating the topic of mental health to someone that we all know from the Hollywood scene and spotlight, being Carrie Fisher, who always suffered from bipolar disorder but actually didn't share that and kept that fact private about herself until, trigger warning, her suicide attempt was broadcasted or exposed to the media, and it became the topic of discussion. Once this was out about her, she opened up about her mental health, and we were exposed as a society on how important it is to take care of our mental health. The text then goes on to say how 50% of American adults currently suffer from mental disorders during their lifetime, and virtually all of us can be said to be mentally ill at one point or another. Quote from the text. Overall, the introduction of this chapter is a nice way to relate to these issues and realize that more people actually struggle with mental disorders and their mental health, and it isn't brought to light until it's too late typically. The chapter then goes on to the topic of popular beliefs on mental disorders, and it starts off by saying that, or when discussing popular beliefs, we see how mental disorders are surrounded by myths and false facts in order to paint an inaccurate image of mental disorders and mental health overall to the public. The text also helps distinguish the clear difference between being mentally ill and mentally healthy. The chapter then goes on to mention how mental health problems can affect 1 out of every 4 people during their lives by altering functioning, behavior, and thinking patterns. We see these attitudes and beliefs about mental health that are shaped by personal knowledge, also about mental illness. So, in regards to your environment, it is important because that also plays a role within someone's familiarity of the topic. By knowing and interacting with someone in their lives with a mental illness can also be a participating factor that may also help someone's or exposure exposure of knowledge to mental illness. Cultural stereotypes is another way, along with media stories and familiarity with institutional practices and past restrictions. So there's that section of the chapter. The chapter then goes on to discuss the next topic on mental disorders, being the types of mental disorders. So the text then decides to focus on 2 specific classifications, being traditional classification, and the second being the DSM-V classification. First discussing the traditional classification, the text reads how the traditional classification system, mental illness, is divided into 2 broad types: organic and functional disorders. Also, when discussing traditional classifications, there are 3 types within these disorders, within itself being, oh my gosh, the first being psychosis, the second being neurosis, which also has can be broken down into 4 types, and then the third being personality disorder. So going into the first one being psychosis, it is more serious than other disorders and can involve a loss of touch, while then moving on to the second one being neurosis, which is a lot less severe than psychosis. And there is a little distortion of reality and the ability to behave in a normal way, but neurotic symptoms prevent the sufferers from being happy being as happy as they want to be. That itself can also be broken down into 4 separate parts. Excuse me. One type of neurosis is an anxiety reaction. The second type of the of neurosis is the combination of obsession and compulsion, leading to the third type of neurosis being the more depressive reaction, which is characterized by a fleeing of sadness, dejection, or self-deprecation. Leading into then the fourth type being a psychological, oh gosh, I mispronounced that, psychological disorder, which includes hysteria and conversion reaction. Mouthful, sorry about that. We then go back into the third type of traditional classification being a personality disorder, which is a much more familiar term that people are comfortable using or comfortable referencing and relating to and understanding. This general category for virtually all sorts of deviant behavior that the psychiatrist can think of but cannot diagnose as either psychotic or neurotic. And then going back to the second type of mental disorder being the DSM-V classification, the text then goes on to state how over 300 mental disorders can now be found in the DSM-V, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. So the text also mentions that and how other mental disorders such as like BPD or even just anxiety can also be put into those categories. All right. The chapter then stops discussing the types of mental disorders in order to focus on the social factors of mental disorders. The first social factor mentioned is social class. And according to social causation, the explanation is that the lower class has more mental disorders because of they are exposed and they're more inclined to be exposed to more stress at an early onset age, as far as financial struggles and other types of common struggles that we see in the lower class, as opposed to middle class and upper class. The second mentioned is so the second mentioned social factor is gender, and gender is different in the specific types of mental disorders because of the differences in gender roles. Which makes complete sense because men are exposed to more opportunities as opposed to women, and research has also suggested and proven that typical female roles tend to promote more emotional attachments and thus more vulnerable to social loss as opposed to men. Thirdly, the chapter then mentions the next social factor, which comes down to young age. We've been led to believe in the past how adults are more inclined to trauma that is prevented with the way our current society runs. It is starting to be understood how younger generations can also be more inclined to trauma that can stick with them through experiences, exposing them to more depression due to change in modern society, including more stress and decrease in social resources for coping with stress. Also, the loss of support from extended families, divorce, and the breakdown of local communities have all created problems for the young. Personally, being a child of divorce and losing people in my life from a young age has had an impact upon me, and I am sure many others. The trauma that we feel from a young age does carry on into our adult life if not mended. So this can be shown through mental illness as well, especially with no guidance or help. The next social factor mentioned in the social profile the next social factor mentioned is a social profile of depressed teens. The chapter then says as many as 12.5% of U.S. teens suffer from major depression at some point during the year and have at least 4 of the classical symptoms. So it is on the incline, and exposure is going to become more important. fifth mentioned was race and ethnicity. I actually am in another race and ethnicity class currently, and I'm learning about how tough this topic can be because of the lines and the divide that was drawn, because it leaves room for question, and there are people who don't know which category they fit in when it comes to race and ethnicity. It overall is a very tricky question because when it comes to answering surveys about race and ethnicity, sometimes there are limited options, and some people don't know exactly how to identify, creating a really complicated topic. So when looking at this within mental disorders, we see how it can be, how it can affect one can affect the other. The sixth one that's mentioned is an urban environment, and the text goes on to say how many studies support the idea that the urban environment is a major producer of mental disorders because of the abundance of physical and social stresses, loneliness, and lack of social support. Once we mention the urban environment factor, it goes on to mention PTSD, or post-traumatic stress disorder, which is a mental illness, and it goes on to elaborate how its symptoms include abuse of alcohol and other drugs, and an emotional numbness, outbursts of rage, severe depression, and reoccurring nightmares as well. After discussing social factors in mental disorders, the chapter then goes on to discussing the importance of a global perspective on mental disorders. And although the society we know now is pushing for more acceptance towards this discussion of mental health and mental illness, however, we look at the rest of the world, we cannot assume the same amount of acceptance about this topic. Cultural forces can determine rates and symptoms of mental disorders. Modern society's culture of competitiveness and individualism differs from traditional agricultural society and promotes more mental disorders. And in developing countries, depression is more likely to appear, or physical symptoms and compulsive disorders can potentially take form. As we start to get close to the end of the chapter, the topic of social or societal responses to mental disorders becomes a part of the discussion. First, starting off with the public, and the public still often believes that the mentally ill are dangerous, dirty, unpredictable, worthless, and even treated more with tolerance than before. We see how in the past asylums were created, and we immediately see how asylums later become the dumping grounds for people with mental disorders. The text then goes on to mention the court aspect of this all, and it mentions how the court also treats mentally ill people in a negative way by putting them in mental institutions or prisons solely to get rid of them and not have them be an issue to worry about. We see that the text mentions the involuntary commitment, denying rights, and insanity defense, but then it then goes on to mention how with the public mentioned and the court, and the third topic would be mental hospitals and how they are institutions where patients are cut off from larger society and led to enclosed living circumstances that overall dehumanizes them. Many state institutions have especially bad situations, including little respect for patients, sexual abuse, specifically on the female patients, and the employment of corrupt and untrustworthy people. Finally, the last section on Chapter 8 is the perspectives of mental disorders. And there are three ways of looking at mental disorders, which is the medical, psychological, or psychosocial, or the labeling model. And first being the medical model sees how mental illness is as similar to a physical disease in that it causes a biological and can be treated in the same way as a physical disease. Second being the psychosocial model, which actually has two versions as well. The theory comes down to the social stress and how it can be divided into the little bit where we learned about the psychoanalytic theory and the social stress theory. So those two go into their own separate categories as well. And then finally mentioned the third and final point being the labeling model, which in the chapter is defined as followers of the labeling model believe that a mental disorder is not a sickness, but only a label imposed upon some disturbing behaviors. And that overall concludes my outline for Chapter 8 on the topic of mental disorders. Thank you.